Invite you to take your seat, find your seat. If you're joining us online, thank you for being with us tonight. My name is Ben Dockery, and I get to serve as the Executive Director for the Lakelight Institute. It's my privilege tonight will be to ask Nancy some questions here in a moment, but to introduce her more formally as we get started. Welcome to those of you who are joining us upstairs as well. Lakelight Institute, when we first got started, there were really three gaps that we as a church and leaders of the church were thinking and praying through what the Institute could do, that we thought we could pitch in, we could play a role in. One of those we ended up naming biblical and theological imagination. So in other words, to be able to see the world as God sees the world takes a certain way of viewing or of imagining, not like imaginative writing stories, but viewing the world. So that was one. So we offer classes and things that help do that. Secondly, personal and cultural formation. So not just my personal piety, what I do in my own life, but how is it that my faith spills out into the culture? And what is it God is inviting me to do into the world, in society? So that was a second gap. And the third one was faith and work integration. And so in other words, what people do on their Sunday, there's oftentimes a big gap between that, their role of faith, and what they do on Monday. And tonight, the reason that we've invited Nancy Ortberg is that for years she has been thinking deeply about this topic, has been speaking on it, has been writing on it, has been coaching others on that. And so we're thankful that she's going to be a voice to help us as a community, the growing folks who are joining us online as well, to think through this issue. So Nancy Ortberg recently stepped away from her role as CEO of Transforming the Bay for Christ. So she's been out in California leading in different capacities. Now she's the director of Horizons, so she's in a new role out there. But you probably know her more likely as a speaker or as an author. So she was one of the teaching pastors at Willow Creek, so down the street, for years. She's written several books. She has also been a leadership coach and consultant, started her own firm, co-founded a firm, and so she has done all sorts of things. Maybe you've been to conferences where she has been a speaker before or been in the room like that. So we're thankful that you're joining us tonight. Looking forward to what you have to say. Just a couple quick housekeeping things as well. So the format is when we do these talks 4 times a year, we invite a thought leader, an author, someone to come and to share with our community. And then they will come and they will share the beginning. And then when they're done, we'll have a chance to sit up here and have a conversation about some of those things and expand into other areas of their thought leadership and places they have served. They can share their expertise with us. So that's what we'll be doing again tonight. For me personally, the reason that I was so excited that Nancy was going to come is that I was at an event. I think it was 2018. I was trying to go back and look at my notes. I didn't save the date, but and Nancy Ortberg was coming up to speak on a topic, and I was sort of at the event, but didn't necessarily want to be at the event. And then a few minutes into her talk, I was like, oh, this is really good and compelling. And there was a specific story that she told that I'm not going to retell, but a specific story that she told that has stayed with me and has been something that I've kind of like carried as a memory of the way that in which God works inside of our vocations and inside of people's lives to do his will and to see his kingdom expand. So I'm hoping that the same will happen for you tonight. So join me in welcoming Nancy Ortberg.
Thank you. I remember that conference, and I don't think I wanted to be there either. So there you go. Let me start off this way. For those of you that are currently working, some of you may fall into, you're in a transition period, some of you may be retired, some of you are students, but for those of you that are working, I want you to write down 2 numbers. On a scale of 1 to 10, how much do you love your job? So write that down or put it in your phone. And then how about the people at your job? On a scale of 1 to 10, how do you feel about the people in your job? I want you to hold that as the context for some of the stuff that we're going to talk about tonight. For any of you that had parents, my guess is at some point when you were being raised, they told you that you only have one chance to make a first impression. Now, I don't know if that's true or not, but most of us got that advice from our parents. And I know as I grew older and was in job interview situations or starting school, sometimes I would think about that. So why in Genesis, when God has a chance to make his first impression and let people know who he is and what he's about, does he choose the story in Genesis 1? Because if I were God, I would start off with, I'm really important, and I'm super powerful, and I know everything lots more than you know. And that's not how Genesis starts off. The first impression God gives to the people is, hi, my name's God, and I'm a worker. And by the way, I've been working before you ever got here, so what I've worked on for you, you don't deserve, but I want to invite you in to see my handiwork and enjoy it. The very first thing that God wants us to know about him is that he is a worker and that he has invited us in our job to co-partner with him in the creation that is our work. When I was 14 years old, I worked for a summer at my dad's company, or the company my dad worked for. And this was a time when computers were brand new and there were these cards with the little chads and you had to poke things out. And honestly, I had no idea what I was doing. I just was told how to do it. Did it for 2 weeks. And at the end of 2 weeks, a woman stopped by my desk and put an envelope on it with a clear panel with my name and address on it. Had no idea what it was. Kind of scared me. She was kind of scary, so I grabbed the envelope, went to the bathroom, and locked myself in the stall. Because I thought it might be a note to have to go to the principal or to the boss's office. I might be in trouble, and I opened it up, and it was a check, a corporate check. It wasn't a wadded up $5 bill that Mrs. Smith gave me for babysitting her bratty little kids, and I had to do the dishes and vacuum and put them to bed. It was typed out. And it was mine. And that was the first time I ever remember living at that intersection of faith and work and realizing that work was a huge gift. Because part of what it means to be made in the image of God is to reflect the way that he first introduced himself in the Bible. To be workers that are joyful about work. Dallas Willard, who, for some of you that heard John this weekend, was not only a philosophy professor at USC, but he was a deeply thoughtful theologian, and he said this, that our work is our primary place of discipleship. Our work. I remember when he said it, I teased him and I said, oh, Dallas, what you mean is our family, because that's always the right answer. He said, no, with the nature of work. And then he said this, pick a job that's not very glamorous, a farmer. If it's 5:30 and the kids are at the table and the food's ready to be eaten and the cow needs to be milked and the fence is down, you go to work. Dallas had a way of recapturing this mystical, magical view of work that I think we lose very quickly after we get hired for a job that we were initially very excited to have. Now, I do think we need to talk about finding too much of our identity in work or overworking, but we're not going to do that tonight. Because I think that message gets baked into us so much that we lose the vision of the wonder of work. So tonight, I want to just talk through a few things that I have found to be really pivotal in my understanding of work. Let me ask you this. How many times do you think an occupation is mentioned in Scripture? Just call out a number. This is the part where you talk. How many? Oh, that's not even funny. That's not even fair. You out. Okay, let me do this one for you. I always have people write down 543 and then add a 3. 5,433 times. Now, after somebody says 10,000, that doesn't sound like a very big number. But when you think about it, it's more than the word love and prayer put together in Scripture. There is something for us here to pay attention to. 5,433 times an occupation is mentioned in Scripture. This is what another quote that Dallas has about work, that if it wasn't so long and my skin wasn't so old, I would have it tattooed on my body, but at this point I'd have to pull the crepiness away and to read it. We should not think of ourselves as destined to be celestial bureaucrats involved eternally in celestial administration. This would only be slightly better than being caught in an everlasting church service. Gotta love that. No, we should think of our destiny as being absorbed in a tremendously creative team effort with unimaginably splendid leadership on an inconceivably vast plane of activity with ever more comprehensive cycles of productivity and enjoyment. And this is what eye has not seen nor ear heard that lies before us in the prophetic vision of Isaiah 64. I don't know how many of you hold that vision of your work, but I hope tonight when you leave that the number you wrote down about your work and the people at your work will have moved to the right. One of the things that this vision of work does is it recaptures in us the vision of God's kingdom. I'm not going to go into detail on this point, but the American dream and the kingdom of God are very different. And one of them we pursue in the belief that that will give us fulfillment and purpose, but it's a cul-de-sac and a dead end. And it's returning to a vision of the kingdom that restirs our imagination for work. Years ago, I was a nurse, and I worked in the emergency room. And there was one doctor in particular who, if he was on the shift for the evening, everybody knew it was going to be a great evening. He happened to be a Christ follower. He didn't talk about it a lot. But the reason everybody loved working with him is he had an ability to make every patient and the people around them feel like a team, like we're in this together. Now, when you would work in the emergency room, there's a very small core team who know each other. But when you're running a code on somebody whose life is in jeopardy, people from radiology and laboratory and respiratory come, and the only way you know who they are is by their name tag. And this doctor would take the time in the middle of tense situations and look at the name tag and use people's names. He would, when it was appropriate, waiting for lab results to come back, or we had a lull in something, he would ask questions and he would be teaching. He would ask somebody when that blood gas comes back at this number, what medication should we push next? Why do you think I'm putting the chest tube in now? Constantly teaching and training us and just making us feel like all of us were important on the team. I remember one night in particular, about 8 o'clock at night, a young girl came in, 24 years old. When somebody that young comes in that's in a precarious position with their health, the tension rises. We didn't know for 3 hours if we were going to send her body down to the morgue or up to the intensive care unit. And there he was doing it again, using our names, involving us in the care the whole way through. At one point, he just stopped and looked at us all and he said, "We're saving this young girl." I'm like, okay, we will. At the end of the code, when the nurses were taking her upstairs with all of her tubes to the ICU, housekeeping came in to clean up. The doctor stepped behind with the intern to debrief the code as he was teaching him, and I was finishing charting. And back in those days, you wrote by hand your message. And the doctor, when he was debriefing the code, at the very end of the time, he was talking to the intern, said, "Hey, did you happen to notice the guy that came in from housekeeping?" And I remember I was done charting, and I thought, I'm just going to keep moving my hand on this paper because I wouldn't leave this room for any amount of money right now, because I knew what his values were. The intern looked at him like he was confused as to why he was being asked a non-medical question, and a little hint of annoyance also. So the doctor went on to say, "Hey, it's important that you understand that when we're running the code and trying to save a life, the importance of housekeeping. Like, we're flipping drugs and equipment and stuff is falling all over the floor, and we're not tripping on anything because housekeeping is keeping it clean. They're putting things back after they've been sanitized where they belong, so when we need an instrument or a medication, it's right there." Still a blank look on this kid's face. So then the doctor said this: "All of the people that work in housekeeping at this hospital are not only invaluable, but they're really good at what they do. But the man that was in tonight, his name is Carlos. His wife's name is Maria. They moved up from Mexico 3 years ago. They send half of their income every month back to their family in Mexico. They live 3 miles from here in a little apartment in Santa Ana, and they have 4 children." And he went on to name the children and their ages. And then he said to this young intern, "I see on the schedule we're supposed to work together next Tuesday. Here's your assignment. You come ready at 3 o'clock in the afternoon, ready to tell me something about Carlos that I don't already know." I know. That moment was a leadership moment. I want to be on a team like that. I want to be a leader like that. I want to value everybody on the team at the same level. Honestly, even though he was the doctor, he made us feel like we were as important as he was, which technically wasn't the case. But it was so remarkable to work with someone like that. And when your leadership is looking through the lens of faith when you lead, it encourages that. I worked with a man named Max Dupree for a number of years. And Max's vision of everybody on the team is important was so critical. I remember him walking out of a fellow CEO's office one time and just beaming when the CEO stopped at the administrator's desk in the front and he asked her about her son's basketball game the night before. You take the time to make everybody on the team feel important. Look at Jesus' leadership team. What an eclectic group of people who were all called together to work together. It's one of the values that seeing your leadership through the lens of faith brings to you. This vision of the kingdom that everybody's contribution is critical. And this ability to orchestrate the working together to accomplish something amazing. In my 30 years of being a student of leadership, the best definition I've ever heard is leadership is a way of helping people contribute to make something extraordinary happen. It's not doing it on your own. It's not getting away and coming up with the right answer. It's a collaborative, catalytic conversation where people feel engaged and bought in and like they're shaping the future together, and something extraordinary happens. And with this ER doc was one of the first times that I got a vision of leadership through the lens of faith that changes things. I also believe that this intersection of faith and work and leadership is probably the most powerful apologetic we have in a post-Christian culture. Certainly the northeast of our country, certainly the Bay Area, most of the West Coast, we're in a definitive post-Christian culture. People have tried Jesus and moved on. And to try to get their attention back, I'm not sure books that used to be very effective with an intellectual approach will have the same effect as what I believe are the two strongest apologetics in a post-Christian culture, and that is serving the poor and the marginalized and the intersection of faith and work. That when we serve the poor and the marginalized, everybody's made in the image of God, and even if they don't believe in God, there is a vibration in their DNA towards that kind of effort. And so when churches lock arms geographically and serve the community, that's an apologetic, but so is faith and work. When I come to my job, whether I'm in an intermediate job that I don't see myself in long term, or in my passion job, or in a job I absolutely hate, to bring my faith to bear on how I am at the workplace is a deep apologetic for the faith over time. Our jobs, whether on a scale of 1 to 10, you would say this is my passion and dream job, or anywhere in between, are not stepping stones to the next thing, but a call from Jesus to live deeply right where you are. I really do believe that so much of what's written, even under the guise of Christianity, is about finding your passion. That is a question of luxury that most people don't have. And it also puts the focus on me instead of the most important essence of work, which is serving other people. I think there's a place for that conversation, but I think it has become way too big in our conversations. My work is not primarily about my personal fulfillment. Philippians chapter 2, most of you are familiar with the part of the chapter that's called the Christ hymn, and most of our Bibles translate it, even though Jesus was God, he gave that up and took upon the form of a servant. One of the professors that John had at Wheaton, Dr. Jerry Hawthorne, said actually the best Greek translation of it is, because he was God, he took upon the form of a servant. You are never more like God than when you are serving, which is how the Bible opens in Genesis, with God serving people and inviting them into the work he's done. So how do we serve at work when we may not be passionately fulfilled by the work we do, when we're irritable and we just want to move on to the next thing? I learned a lot 40 years ago when I was a nurse, again in the ER. One afternoon, Friday afternoon, I was 3 weeks away from moving to Chicago to finish my seminary degree at Trinity. I had just met my husband on a blind date, which seemed a little odd to be meeting somebody that I was interested in right before I was moving to Chicago. I was working double shifts in the ER to make enough money to get ready to leave. And a woman came in, and it was probably 3:30 in the afternoon, which meant it was time to go home for me. And when she came in, the doctor looked at me and he said, "Hey, would you mind staying for a few minutes while we're giving a report and get her history and physical?" Now, did I mention I had been working a lot of double shifts and I was really tired? I was a little grumpy, and I did what every good Christian would do. I said, "I'd be glad to." And on the inside, I thought, why me? Why me? All those other nurses, they're not working double shifts. They're not moving to Chicago in a couple weeks. Well, I'm tired. I want to go home. So I went in, I took her history and physical, I put her in a gown, I drew some blood. I felt a little annoyed because she had the flu. It's like, you don't go to the ER when you have the flu. She was getting ready to go up to Lake Tahoe and meet her husband and her kids up there who had left a day early. She had to stay down for work. I thought, just go to the doctor the next day. So then I came out, I gave the doctor all the report, I got ready to leave, and he said, "Hey, Nancy, do you mind staying just a few more minutes till her blood work comes back?" I'd be glad to. I was so mad and frustrated. And then her blood work came back on a fax machine. If you're under 40, you can Google it. It's a machine that used to sit on top of a desk and paper would spit out of it. And I went over to look at her lab results, and I kind of froze. And I called the doctor over. She didn't have the flu. She had fulminating leukemia. She never left the hospital. She was in the ICU for 6 more weeks. I visited her probably 3 times a week. I met her husband and her children. By the time she died, her face was unrecognizable. It was awful. And the whole way home, God and I had a little conversation like this. "So you're getting ready to go to seminary, getting ready to study the Bible and be a pastor." And I put a 32-year-old woman in front of you at the end of your shift, and all I asked was for you to be present with her. And all you felt was frustration because your focus was on yourself. This intersection of faith and work and leadership isn't just about what I'm going to do for the world. It's what God needs to do inside of me. And the dark, ugly side that I'm really good at keeping hidden from most people, if I will let work become a place of discipleship, will start to break open. That I'm just not a gift to the organization because I bring such great leadership, that I have a lot to learn myself. As you can imagine, when those lab test results came back, I clocked out and then sat by her bedside for 4 more hours until her sister came. She was in shock. She was terrified. And I just wanted to go home and get in bed. And the irony of me getting ready in a couple weeks to leave to finish my seminary degree was not lost on me on the drive home. So the ways in which God has used work in my life to show me who I am on the inside that is so different than who I imagine and think myself to be. And then the last thing I want to talk about is for about 10 or 11 years, I was a business consultant with a man named Patrick Lencioni. Some of you may have read his New York Times bestseller books, Death by Meetings. It's great, just worth it for the picture on the cover. 5 Dysfunctions of a Team, just great stuff. And in his model of leadership, he talks about the importance on a leadership team of building trust and engaging in conflict. I want to talk about those 2 things, and then I'll end this time and we can open it up for some interactive stuff. Most organizations, when you ask them on a leadership team, does your team trust each other? In 11 years of doing that work, I never had anybody say anything but, yes, we trust each other. Part of the problem with trust is we all presume it, especially in churches. But trust is really hard work. Trust involves three things: character, competency, and what you hear most, but not in Lencioni's model, the next word you mostly hear is chemistry. I totally disagree with that. My goal and my hope for everybody on a leadership team is you have people on that team with whom you have no chemistry. Because I think it was Jesus that said, what good is it if you love people that are like you? Do not even the heathens do that. Where's the challenge in that? Character and competency. So on a leadership team, if you're building a cohesive leadership team, you will have chances to look at and call into question people's character and competency. Now, oftentimes, when people call into question somebody's character, the first response is, I cannot believe you would call my character into question. I don't know, 24 hours a day, 7 days a week, my character's up for questioning. It's part of how we grow and trust each other. Bob, you didn't get me that report on time, and it made me behind with the work my team had to do. I'm having a really hard time trusting you right now. So now we have a chance to have conversations about why did that happen? Competency. You guys don't know me, but if you hired me to lead a team, maybe not a bad choice. If you hired me to be the CFO, really bad choice. Not because my character's bad necessarily in this case, but because my competency does not lie in spreadsheets. I need a Benadryl when I see a spreadsheet. I can hardly breathe. I don't like them. I don't understand them. I want them to go away. Character and competency on a team. And then the third one that both Brene Brown and Patrick Lencioni have written so beautifully about is vulnerability. Yep, on a corporate leadership team, there needs to be vulnerability. The admission of mistakes. I think Christians are some of the worst people admitting when we're wrong. We want to protect this idealized version that we have of ourselves. And this great vulnerability that says, I dropped the ball, I made a mistake, I don't know what the answer is, what do you think? That invites people to bring their humanity to work and to feel like it's a peer-to-peer group. So building trust over time, admitting our mistakes, talking about character and competency. The trust is mostly in Patrick's model, though, for the purpose of engaging in conflict. So maybe 15 or 20 years ago, I was with Patrick at a speech he was giving in a huge room. I bet there were 10,000 CEOs in there. It was not a Christian gathering. And when he got to the conflict part, he said, somewhat rhetorically, what organizations do you think are the worst at engaging in conflict? Everybody in the crowd yelled out, churches. I'm like, oh no, they know. I couldn't believe it. But it's true. Les and Leslie Parrott, who are Christian psychologists, say that conflict is the only way to intimacy. Intimacy with a spouse, which is one thing, but just intimacy and deep relationships with other people. That on a corporate team, on a nonprofit team, on a church team, the ability to engage in conflict really produces growth. And it allows people to do decision-making that they're completely bought in on. So a number of years ago, my consulting partner and I were working with a team in the Bay Area, 2008. The only reason I remember the year is because most of the teams we worked with were struggling financially. This team, which was a startup organization, most of the people on the team were in their late 20s, early 30s, had grown by about 35%. Very unusual. So we're having this 2-day offsite with this team, and we go through the 5 dysfunctions of a team and set that all up. And one of the things that's interesting about being a consultant, my partner Kent was with me that day, and usually by lunch on the first day, everybody on the team individually will pull you aside to tell you who the problem on the team is. Never once in 11 years has anybody said, I'm the problem on the team. You're going to find out sooner rather than later, so you just might as well know right now. So by lunchtime, Kent and I pulled away together for a little bit, and we looked at each other, and at the same time, we said, Lisa. Everybody had come, except Lisa, to tell us that Lisa was the problem on the team. So we set up the trust, the conflict. We go through making decisions and getting results and holding people accountable. And on the second day, we're having a strategic discussion. And Steve, the youngest guy on the team, 28, 29 years old, is moving around in his chair like he's going to explode. I have no idea what's happening. Lisa's talking about something around their strategic decision-making, and he just erupts at her and yells at her in front of the team, "Lisa, you're a jerk. You just never get your work done on time." And I'm like, no, that's not exactly the way we do conflict, but hey. I remember kind of freezing and thinking, I'm not exactly sure what to do next. Kent, my consultant, who's a 5 on the Enneagram and barely has a pulse, he's just so even-keeled, stood up and said, "I'll take this." I was like, oh, phew. And then he says, I'm guessing by now, Steve's already thought of a couple of different ways he could have said that better. So that relieved a little of the tension. But then he takes a red marker and he turns around on the flip chart as if we're going to forget what just happened. And in red, in the left-hand upper corner, writes, "Lisa, you're a jerk." I'm like, oh, don't think this is good. And in the right-hand corner, "You never get your work done on time." Super uncomfortable. Nobody's looking up. Everybody's looking at their shoes. And then he says this: "These are two really different things. And with your permission, we're going to start on the right. We're going to answer the question, does Lisa not get her work done on time? And then we're going to come back to the way it got said." So then everybody started looking back at Kent. And Kent said, "Let's just go around the circle. I don't want a story or an explanation. I just want one word, yes or no. Do you agree with that statement that Lisa doesn't get her work done on time?" Just when he had reassembled eye contact with him, they all just looked back at their toes. So he just named him, "John, we're going to start with you." Went around the circle. Awkward, awful. Everybody said Lisa doesn't get her work done on time, except one person who I think in a misguided attempt to be Lisa's BFF said, "Oh, sometimes she does." But that's not really the truth. Now, at this point, when there was a consensus around the team after a very awkward conversation that Lisa doesn't get her work done on time, guess who was ready to talk? Lisa's face was a mixture of furious and embarrassed. It was like her face was angry, but she was fighting back the tears. And she said, "First of all, I can tell by looking at every one of you, you've had this conversation amongst yourselves." She was not wrong. For a year, they had been going out of the meetings frustrated with Lisa, but instead of saying something in the meeting, they went behind closed doors and shut the door and talked about her. Patrick calls that the meeting after the meeting. And the reason we do it is it's one of the best feelings in the whole world. You disagree with somebody in a meeting, and you don't have the courage to say anything, but boy, you pull 3 people in your office that all agree together. It feels so superior, doesn't it? That feels good, but it shouldn't. And then she said, then somebody, I think again, it was the BFF person, said, "Is there something going on at home? Because really up until about a year ago, Lisa, you were a very high performer." Now that sounds like a nice question, but she waited a year to ask it. And Lisa said, "No, there's nothing going on at home." She said, "For the last year, we have been growing like crazy. I'm the only high-level administrator on this team, and every single one of you is handing me a third more work than I'm used to, and I'm drowning." CEO's a little embarrassed at this point. He's like, "We can solve this pretty quickly because we're making money. Lisa, you have permission to write up a job description and hire somebody starting tomorrow." But the bigger problem was, why had the team waited so long to be honest with her? And then Steve stood up and he asked my consultant friend Kent to sit down. And man, this is not a Christian team. But what I saw next was some of the best form of spiritual formation I've ever seen. He said, "First of all, I'm super embarrassed. If my mom was here," he said, "she would wash my mouth out with soap and sit me in the corner." And I'm like, yeah, she should. And he said, "I just got so frustrated, largely from keeping it inside for so long. I am so sorry I said it the way I said it. Here's how I wish I could say it again. Lisa, I find myself increasingly frustrated when every week I come into the meeting and the work that usually falls on your plate didn't get done, and it stops every one of us from getting our work done." Now, if you can't hear a sentence like that, you probably don't belong on a leadership team. That's a beautiful way to say it. Here's the magic in that. A month later, we came back, because we, for 2 years, would work with them once a month and then phone calls in between. You should have seen the way they were operating when we came back. The trust had grown very deep. Their ability to come up against awkward conversations had grown so much that they were having them more and more easily. They had gone over the line and hurt feelings and said things poorly, but they pulled themselves back and recovered and engaged in really healthy leadership. It's a little bit like a toddler when a toddler's learning to walk. What you don't say is, oh, that's awful. You're doing it all wrong. Oh, you're pulling your knees up too high. You're falling down. Never mind. You're not going to do this. We're going to outsource walking for you. You're done. We don't do that when people make mistakes. When a little toddler makes mistakes, we get down at their eye level and we cheer them and we encourage them to come on. And if they fall down, we pick them back up. If that's not the gospel, I don't know what is. There are so many places in our work that are ripe for our full understanding of the kingdom of God and what it means to be a Christian at work, not in a corny, old-fashioned way, but in a way that really honors people and really does the hard work of conflict and forgives people and shows up for people. And I believe that may be one of the best apologetics we have. And I hope your numbers move towards a 10 for the work that you do and the people that you work with. That's all I have to say. Thanks.
All right. Thank you very much.
Welcome.
Just for Mike Woodruff and the board members of Lakelight, you can't hire her. She already has a job.
I wouldn't move to Illinois if you would.
I'm feeling a little insecure right now. And had a little regret that I was like, wow, she's like calling me out on a lot of these things right now myself.
Me too.
So hopefully it happened to you as well.
Me too.
Thank you for sharing. That's exactly the kind of things and kind of conversations that we're hoping to have. And we are going to get to that part where you ended, the role in which spiritual formation inside of our workplaces is just, shines brightly. Yeah. You mentioned the first time that you connected faith and work, getting that check. That was a fascinating little story. I'd love to ask the same thing about, you've taught on leadership, you've written on leadership, you've served in so many leadership roles. When's the first time that you sort of understood you were in a leadership position or somebody called that gift out in your life? Or tell us that story.
Yeah, a little bit when I volunteered during college at a local church, and my youth pastor had been a research scientist at the City of Hope and was sitting at his microscope one day and felt God saying, go to seminary and be a youth pastor. Okay. He was just a remarkable man. And he was the first person that ever said, you're a leader and a teacher. And I don't really know that I knew what that meant much, but it gave me a placeholder for years in the future when those words got named again. I had some place to put them to try to make sense of them. Yeah.
So early on, 19, sounds like college,
I was probably 19 or 20. Okay. And then I think when we were at Willow Creek, there was a lot of talk about leadership, maybe a little too much, but a lot of good talk about what does it mean to be a leader, taking that role seriously, how to do it in the best possible way.
And it sounds like you had at least a mentor, someone that played a role in your life at that stage.
Definitely. Had a couple of bosses there that were just great at both encouraging and giving tough feedback. Like, okay, if you had to do that over again, how would you do that differently? Which usually meant you kind of messed up and let's talk through this. But it was said very nicely. But then also encouraging when things went well.
Yeah, that's good. Yeah, so another thing, just getting to know you a little bit personally. So you've written a couple of different books on some of these topics specifically. One of them is about rubber bands, is that right?
It's really about nonlinear leadership.
Okay, so why a book on rubber bands? What is nonlinear leadership? Tell us what's going on
there. The rubber band thing came from a guy that I worked with at Willow named Greg Hawkins, who would talk about the tension that you would have to hold in leadership, and I loved that. What's a rubber band supposed to do? If you pull it too fast and too far, it'll break. If you don't pull it at all, it doesn't do what a rubber band's supposed to do. So that tension word that I think is really important to understand in leadership. But nonlinear leadership is, there are some people who are wired, a lot of engineers, to do things in a very sequential way, which is a gift. I don't have that gift. I think nonlinear leadership is a lot more about how do you build a culture, and that's not a linear process. So how do you build a culture where people can flourish, use their gifts, do the best of what they can do, and live out of values?
And are there, I guess, specific examples where you have attempted to do that yourself in the leadership roles that you've had in terms of putting teams together or rearranging the bus? Or
absolutely. I think those are the things that I do more reflexively than a sequential ordering of leadership, like step A, and then we do B, and then we do C. Very much a team-building leader, and to have a vision of what can happen, and then to, first of all, bring the best out of the people that already exist. How do you know who you have to move around until you've worked with them a while to see where the fit is? And then helping people either change positions or move somewhere else so that the team that we have is most suited to do the work that we need to do.
Yeah. I've been on teams where somebody has that vision and they can see who needs to sit where, and it's just sort of, it seems like a gift that they've been given that they can sort out.
It's a form of leadership. Yeah.
Who can sit, who should sit where, and what they should do,
and who shouldn't sit where.
Yeah. That's right. Okay, so I want to before we get to the spiritual formation stuff, I want to ask some more of those organizational type questions, just in terms of, so you worked with Lencioni for quite some time.
About 10 years.
Yeah, and those of you, as you said, who haven't read some of his books, I could not recommend them highly enough myself.
And they're super easy to read.
The Fables specifically, but The Advantage was like a...
That kind of consolidates everything together.
Yeah, it brought so many of those things together. So in that, he says there's kind of an X factor for advantages. Some teams can get ahead of everyone else, and I'm reading it thinking it's going to be tech or sales or cash or building or location or something. It's not any of those. Just briefly catch us up on what that is and
Yeah, I think Patrick would say that the most underutilized strategic advantage that any company has is teamwork. One of the guys that sits on my board of the organization I ran up until a few months ago, and now I work part-time for, is a very successful, under-the-radar venture capitalist in the Bay Area. And I was in his office one day, and in the corner of his whiteboard, he had written idea, leader, team. And he pointed to me and he said, which one of those three is the most important? And I remember thinking, this feels like a trick question. I don't know. Ideation is my top strength finders. So I love the idea one. But he said, hands down, a VC invests in a team. He said, ideas are a dime a dozen. But a great team that's executing, that's cohesive and executing well together is kind of unstoppable.
And that is, it seems like it's directly connected to what you talked about in terms of the meeting after the meeting, or some of the political things that get stuck in organizations that really stamps out people's best contribution. Yes. Is that the right way to think about that?
Yeah, so in a couple of his books, he'll talk about any organization, in order to be successful, needs to be good at two things. They need to be smart, which is all the highly measurable black and white stuff, finances, strategy, marketing. But it also needs to be healthy. Minimum amount of politics. People really want to work there. The morale's high. And then he says, which I think is brilliant, a healthy team will almost always figure out a way to get smart. A smart team rarely figures out a way to get healthy. So sustainability over the long...
Can you say that one more time?
A healthy team will almost inevitably find out ways to get smarter. Okay. A smart team will very rarely move towards health. And part of the reason is, in business school, you're taught the smart side of the equation, so you focus on that. It's measurable, so that makes you feel good. But the soft skills are really not soft. They are a game changer. And that is involving people in a minimum amount of politics and building a healthy leadership team that has high morale. People want to be there. They contribute the best. They encourage other people on the team to contribute the best. They don't get their egos tweaked when somebody else is successful. They're celebrating and cheering them on. They celebrate and then they move on to the next thing.
And I would assume that one of the big features of that is in terms of is just honesty. And you talked about churches not being good at that, and I certainly think that's fair.
It's a huge. It's so at the bottom, the triangle, the 5 dysfunctions of a team, trust and conflict are at the bottom. So you build trust in order to engage in conflict so that you can make great decisions, which he calls commitment, but that's really a decision-making lens. And then you hold people accountable so that you get the results you want to get. And on that triangle, he said, if you spend a disproportionate amount of time on trust and conflict, commitment, accountability, and results will fall into line pretty quickly.
So what role does feedback play in that? Because that's obviously a big part. It sounds like Lisa didn't get the feedback that she needed early enough.
Not until it was too late.
Yeah, until she got in front of everybody.
Yeah.
So that's not ideal. So what role does feedback have? And if you're coach, I mean, I know you coach a lot of different leaders. So
Yeah.
what if that's not easy for someone? Let's just say I'm asking for a friend, right?
Sure.
How would you coach that person in getting better at giving feedback, and how does that serve the team?
I think the first thing I would do is ask them in the course of their career, have there been a couple of times when a leader has given them feedback and it has really changed something in them? Hardly ever had anybody say no to that. So then you begin to see the power of it. So now the next step is, how can I do better at doing it with the people I'm working with? Both the positive feedback and the negative feedback. Mm-hmm. They're both critically important because they reflect who we are as human beings. The positive feedback, Gottman writes a lot about marriage, but there's a lot of stuff that's written about marriage that can be extrapolated up to leadership teams. And I think it's a 5-to-1 ratio for a healthy marriage, that for every one difficult thing you need to say to your spouse, you have invested 5 different times of saying something that you appreciate about them. So I think in a corporate level, let's go for 3-to-1. So as a leader, can I be giving positive feedback to people, 3 times a week? And, I'll just make it simple. I'll have them get out a Post-it note and just make a little tick, put the people's names on your team and make little tick marks, so that you earn the right then, the one time you have to give some difficult feedback, to say, okay, here's something I need to tell you. And I don't believe in the Oreo sandwich approach. So if it's time for me to give you some difficult feedback, I'm not going to come in and give you 2 nice things and sandwich it in the middle, because everybody knows what you're doing. It just feels kind of dumb. So I just want to say, I trust our relationship is strong enough that you're going to be able to handle what I have to say to you. But it's really important, and I think you'll be a better leader on the other side of it. And sometimes I would even say, let me tell you about leaders that have told me hard stuff about myself. We need more of that, and it's so spiritually formative.
So I want to ask, not about organizational leadership now, but I want to shift from that to more personal leadership. So obviously, leading yourself can be one of the most difficult things to do. So when you're coaching executives or team leaders or whoever, how do you help them see where they are getting stuck themselves, and how do you help them identify that and sort of move forward?
I ask a lot of questions. And usually by asking a couple of questions, we can get to a place where they will land. Most of them know where they're stuck, but they're a little nervous to say it out loud. And so in the privacy of just a one-on-one conversation, by asking a couple questions and creating a little bit of a safe environment, and if they don't get there, I can give an observation. If I had to guess as an outsider, one of the areas I see you might feel stuck is this. And then for the most part, people are kind of wanting to go there because they know it down deep, even though they're afraid of it, and we'd always much rather just hear the good parts than the bad parts. This is kind of a silly example, but when my dad died, John did the funeral. And the best thing he did at the funeral is he talked about all the wonderful things about my dad, and then he talked about all the difficult things about my dad. And if that's not where love lives, I don't know where it lives. Because it certainly doesn't only live in the good parts of my dad. Everybody in there would have thought, well, when are you going to get to the other part? It's like that seam right there. And I think we're all hungry for somebody that will accept us right there on that seam. So I ask a lot of questions, and it doesn't take long to get there. And even that question, where do you personally feel stuck? About 15 years ago, I read a longitudinal study that was done by McKinsey Consulting and a university in Canada, and they studied organizational change initiatives. They found that 2/3 of them fail, and I remember thinking, I hope they didn't pay a lot of money, because anybody could have told them that. And when your organizational change initiatives fail, it just breeds cynicism in the organization. In fact, I'll tell you something about that if I remember, but I might not. But then they went back and they studied the 1/3 of the organizations where the change initiatives stuck and created momentum. And here's what they found. A clear theme in all of them was a relentless commitment to being a learning culture. That's why I love this. Never stop learning together. And what did it mean to be a learning culture? 3 things. The learning always starts with me. The change always starts with me. I'm much better at saying on a team, well, if Ben would change this, and John would change this, and Lisa would change this, we'd be great. No. I have to own what I need to change. That's the first thing. Second one is there's no undiscussable topics. No elephants allowed in the room at a leadership team meeting. We talk about everything. I had one CEO that bought Beanie Baby elephants for everybody on his team and put them at the desk. And then the third is, if we have a chance, we're going to solve a problem at a systems level, not a Band-Aid level. We're not going to problem solve. We're going to change the system so that the problems don't keep happening. But that number one is that the learning starts with me. And I will often say that in an offsite and just set the tone for the primary thing we're going to walk away from in 2 days. And when I come back is, what do I need to do differently? And then we actually do an exercise at the end of the 2 days where you have to write down the name of everybody on your leadership team. And then you have to out loud say, here's what you need to keep doing, and here's what you should do differently and change. It's not anonymous, and it's not written on paper. It's verbal, and it's face-to-face.
Free consulting right there. Here we go. Do the exercise. Let us know how it goes. Yeah. Do it in your family, right?
Yeah.
So I should have used, we were talking beforehand about how ChatGPT could have written all these questions that we were going to discuss. Instead, I wrote them, but I should have done ChatGPT on this one. So I wrote down a handful of places where individual leaders can get stuck and when they can't move forward. So I'm just going to rattle through these. You can give feedback, you can give an example. If nothing, we can just move on to the next one. So first one is imposter syndrome. There are leaders who deal with imposter syndrome. So talk to that leader real quick.
Everybody suffers from it. Everybody. Just when you think you're the only one, you're just not. Everybody struggles with it. Some more than others, but there's not a person in this room, there's not a person I have ever worked with that doesn't have some degree of that disease.
And what do we do about it? Awareness. I mean, that's...
Yeah, honestly, we were talking earlier before this started about Enneagram and DISC and Myers-Briggs and Working Genius. All of them are just a way of following what St. Augustine said a long time ago, was knowledge of God begins with knowledge of self. It's not a narcissistic journey. It can be, but it's not supposed to be. But it's just, who am I? And I think realizing everybody feels that way helps. But making mistakes and moving forward and past them is one great treatment for imposter syndrome. The Soul of Shame is a great book to read by Kurt Thompson. Wow, that'll help. But even having a discussion on your team, hey, I kind of struggle with this, or I just read this article about imposter syndrome. Any of you suffer from that? Or pass the article around, start a conversation.
Yeah.
In what ways do you suffer from imposter syndrome?
I love that. I mean, like in our little shield, timeless wisdom for modern life, you're quoting a church father and bringing it into modern day leadership.
Well,
I love it.
I think one of the things John does better than almost anybody I know is live deeply at that intersection of spiritual formation and leadership. What is it about our spiritual gift, whatever our spiritual gift might be, hospitality, but in this room, leadership, and how does God use that both to help culture, to help us earn money, and to teach us about the wonderful parts of ourselves and the broken parts of ourselves?
Well, this place to get stuck could be actually a spiritual formation thing now that I think about it, but so leadership anxiety. Lots of leaders are just carrying all sorts of forms of leadership anxiety.
Yeah.
So help talk to that leader that might be stuck in that situation.
Tonight, go on Amazon and get the book Managing Leadership Anxiety by Steve Cuss. Have you had him here?
We have not had Cuss, no.
Big mistake. Get him out here. It's fabulous because most leaders, we think we're not the anxious ones. And he kind of pulls the cover back and says, actually, among the most anxious people. So you have to do your own work as a leader on where are the places in your life where you have anxiety. Now, anxiety looks really different in different types of people. Anxiety can look like, oh, I'm so worried, and that's what we think anxiety is, and so we think, well, I don't have that. The vein that stands out on your temple when you're mad, that's anxiety. Anxiety is when I don't get what I think I need, which is like 75 times a day, okay? And then he makes this great case in the book that you have to deal with your own anxiety, and then you walk into a room of 10 other people that you have to lead who have their own anxiety, but they don't know it either. Yeah. So welcome to the most difficult job on the planet. So managing your own anxiety is so important. When we were at Willow, there was a woman on staff named Cheryl Flesher, and she really dealt with spiritual formation. And one day, there was a training for those of us that were leaders in different ministries in a room like this. She had a flip chart. She invited us to call out sins into which leaders especially struggle. And so we were calling things out. She wrote them all over the flip chart. And then 2/3 of the way down, she drew a horizontal line like a math problem. And then in capital letters underneath all of that, she wrote fear and pride. So She said, you can trace any of these to the deeper work of fear and pride. So this is where the work if you just work on the stuff on the top, you're just going to do behavioral modification. If you go to the root cause of it, you're going to change it. And then she went to the word pride and crossed it out and wrote fear. Our work is to look at what we're afraid of. And I've never read a book like Managing Leadership Anxiety that addresses that issue better than anything I could say.
And to your earlier quote about Dallas Willard, I mean, if the workplace is the primary place of spiritual formation and discipleship, then God is deeply interested in that work and what he's doing in us in that moment. Yeah.
Clearly, because 10,000 times it's mentioned, 5,433 times.
Okay, that's good. A couple more. So decision fatigue. So leaders who just get all sorts of decisions thrown at them, and at some point, they're just, they can't move forward. They get stuck in indecision or decision fatigue, however you want to frame that up. What do you do there?
I'm going to hold on to that thought. I'm going to go back to the anxiety just to make one point that I think links it, is when I worked with leaders, I didn't do research to back this up, but intuitively, I think about 25% of our overwork is driven by anxiety. It's the myth that when I get home from work, if I can just get the kids fed and down to bed and spend 2 more hours at work, it's going to make a difference. Mostly I'm treating my anxiety here. It's not going to change anything. I have 8 hours a day. I really have to believe that in a limited amount of time, I'm capable of making all the decisions I need to make to be a good enough leader, to be a good leader. And so again, it goes back to, I think anxiety drives a lot of decision fatigue. I also think looking at a more collaborative model on your team, where certainly you may be the leader of the team and you make the final call, but you really are engaging the wisdom of everybody on the team to make that decision. That makes the yoke easier to bear. And then I think like anything, just to name it and say, I'm feeling this with my team and see what resources they might bring to it. But I really think a more collaborative leadership model relieves you of a lot of that.
Yeah, that's helpful. So here's a couple more. We have a bunch of young adults here, which I'm really glad. So people that are looking for their calling. You talked a little bit about this earlier, but sometimes you just get stuck in a job and you just sort of plow through the rest of your life, as you said, and that's very common specifically in certain times in history and other places.
Right.
But people that are trying to get at that question, maybe they're unsettled in their current job or they're just looking for something else.
Yes.
Talk to us about what do we do in that?
I'm going to give you another book. I think it's a great question. I think when it becomes the central question, that's where it gets off target. And that's where it becomes all about me and my fulfillment and less about serving people right where I am right now. I think there's been a lot of great books written on this. Tim Keller's book, Every Good Endeavor, is terrific. But the best one I've personally read on it is Visions of Vocation by Stephen Garber. It's InterVarsity Press. And he puts forth a vision of what a vocation can actually do.
He is coming to speak.
Yes, I would come back to hear him. He's a remarkable human being.
He is.
On top of being a thought leader. But this vision of what can I do with my life and where are the clues that God has embedded in who he made me that I have to unpack to figure out what that is. And then this is really important, especially if you're young. Very, very rarely, and I'm not sure it would be good, can you ever jump from college into that vision of vocation. It is very often a nonlinear, circuitous route where you are learning more and more about yourself, where you are growing in maturity. And as you get older, those things start to align and that vision can become more clear.
Yeah. It's helpful. And it's an ongoing thing.
It is ongoing.
There's seasons
and no job is going to fulfill every part of it that you think and hope that it will.
Yeah, both of those resources you mentioned, the Keller book, Every Good Endeavor, is actually one that we use in the Fellows program. So we have a Fellows program as part of Lakelight, and that's one of the sort of key books in holding that curriculum together.
And if you can plow through Kiefer, go ahead and read them. But
go to
about
the next
4
level.
pages in, and I was done.
Yeah. Okay, so one more place where it seems to me that people get stuck, and I wrote this one in from the conversation we had last night about people who work so much that they don't have a hobby or they don't have an activity in which they lose track of time for 30 minutes a day. Am I saying that right? Am I getting the phrase right?
Yeah.
So talk to us about somebody that's in that. I mean, they have so much on them that nothing else outside of work,
Well, and the important thing is the context for that concept of having a replenishing activity that you do on a weekly basis where you lose track of time came out of a study with Duke University, Azusa Pacific, and Notre Dame. And they studied burnout in leaders. And all the things you would think that a leader could do to prevent against burnout was not at the top of the list. That was at the top of the list. So it's not just frivolous, it's every leader, not even leader, every human being needs cycles of renewal. It reminds us that we're finite human beings. Part of the beauty of the theological profundity of that study is that when I'm engaged in this hobby and I'm losing track of time, the world is still spinning on its axis and I've had nothing to do with it. I am the created, not the creator. And it frees me from that burden of leadership that was never meant to be that heavy on our shoulders. So I think about half the leaders I work with can name their hobby immediately, and the other half look at me like, I have no idea what you're talking about. So I think for us to think about what gives us life and how do we practice that and engage in it on a regular basis so that we're bringing life instead of anxiety and pressure to our leadership.
So I learned it was your friend last night, Andy Crouch, who's also spoken quite a bit about this. He makes a distinction between a creaturely calling, so back to our question about calling, and then our vocational calling, and saying that in Genesis 1, your first calling is actually to be a creature, to recognize, as you just said, that I am a created being first and foremost before God wants me to do all these things for him and go bear his image and everything else, is recognize that you are to receive and recognize you are.
Drop the mic. We're done here.
Yeah, he has such a good distinction.
It's something that we have to keep coming back to. When people say, "Oh, I read that, I heard it, and now I get it," it's like, no, you don't. You have to fight your way back to that center 26 times a day, and that's the journey. That's the journey. Is not the I got it now. It's the can I clear that pathway, or do I need to get my machete out and find my way back to that center with God where I am the created, which means I get taken care of and I'm loved, and that's the most important thing.
Yeah. Right in the middle of receiving that email or that the meeting doesn't go as well. Those are the moments where that happened to me this week. I was talking with my wife about, a certain email or something comes through and you can forget all the theology, all the stuff you talk about forever,
easily.
Live in a world that doesn't really exist, but it feels like it does.
That's human. Yeah. It's a little bit like imposter syndrome. You think you're the only one. No, that is the journey. That is what it means to follow Jesus, is over and over and over again. I forget him. I get swallowed up in my own anxiety, and I have to remind myself. And then when I remind myself, I often say, well, do I really even believe that? Well, I used to. Okay, let me find my way back there. Oh, yeah, there I am. Okay. And maybe it lasts for 53 seconds, and then you have to fight your way back again. That is the journey.
Yeah, it is.
Yeah.
Yeah, but God meets us right there. That is time and time again. So, okay, I want to shift and move from organizational leadership to more personal stuff to women in leadership. Okay, so I heard this question. I'm quoting you on a panel. You may not even agree with what you said at the time.
Chances are I won't remember it.
You were asked, what is the most important thing about being a woman in leadership? And you said, I get asked this question all the time. The most important thing, if I'm writing it down right, was to not think about the fact that you're a woman as the first thing. That was your answer. So you still agree with that question?
100%. I love being a girl. I don't want to be a guy. I don't wake up every morning thinking, I'm a woman. I just am. I'm not sure how much difference there is. I think there's some difference in women leadership and men leadership, but I just don't spend a whole lot of time thinking about that part of my leadership. Yeah.
Okay, so follow up. So I have 3 daughters. Okay. Each one of them is sort of a leader in their own way. We're watching and, trying to fan the flame where we can. So I want to be like a genius one day, and when they come to me and ask a question like this, I'm going to quote you. So give me the feedback in front of all these people. Like when they ask me that question, okay, Dad, so I'm a woman, I'm in this situation, I'm leading. How do I think about this? Like what advice? Give me some advice, because I appreciate your answer to this, but I feel like it seems like there's maybe more in this conversation or not, or maybe that's the one and only answer is.
Well, I don't think anything is the one and only answer. I think the more comfortable you get with who you are, which also means who you're not, which is not nearly as much fun to get comfortable with, But as soon as you get more and more comfortable with that, the pressure of that lessens. So certainly, maybe when I was younger, I felt that. I have been fortunate enough to largely have been only in churches that really embraced women in an egalitarian way. So very rarely have I been in that situation. I know in seminary, I think I was one of 6 women back in those days, and every day I would get asked, now tell me again why you're here. I'd be like, same reason you are. So I would feel it some.
I met my wife, you don't know this, in seminary, so she was doing a counseling degree, but she had been asked out, like, because there were so few women in our classes.
Exactly.
As well. She'd been asked out like 16 times the first month. Something like that.
And it's always in the form of, God
seminary,
told me I'm supposed to marry you. And
literally, like somebody said something to that effect.
Don't ever say that, and don't ever let anybody say that to you. So goofy. That's just a desperate line. That's just desperate.
It is God's will.
Yeah.
I tried it. And, so anyway, she's still
good for
here.
you. Good for you. I think getting comfortable with your mistakes, getting comfortable with who you are and who you're not, realizing that a lot of the times if men make you feel uncomfortable because you're a woman, it's probably more their issue. And the best chance I have at changing or shaping a difference in their thought is to be the best leader I know how to be. And chances are I'm not going to change it. Honestly, a lot of times it's the other women leaders that can be the most difficult. Ooh, we just saw a lot of head nods right there. And that's unfortunate. Sometimes you just have to pull people aside and say, are you okay with what's going on? Did I do something? But I think just being really comfortable with who you are is that.
So in this same topic, one other question that's in the literature a lot on this is the phrase mom guilt or something connected to. So specifically women who have younger kids, not always younger kids, but younger kids. And they're walking through this, they're trying to lead, but yet somehow it seems like they're carrying a different burden. So talk a little bit about that. I'm sure you've advised.
I think it's real, and I think it's more of a burden on women than it should be. I think when my kids were little, I stayed home for the first 5 years. Then I worked part-time with a lot of flexibility for that very reason. I wanted to be present. But I think you also want to be in a marriage where you have a shared partnership, where there's as close as you can get, it's probably never 50-50, but there isn't the man leaning away from the running of the household, which is, I have a leader that I worked with who said the reason he hires a lot of moms that stayed at home, he said, if they can run a household, they can run a small country. I want them on my team. It's like, yes, all those balls you have to juggle. I was on a panel one time. I was the only woman on it, and there was a guy that stood up, and he was angry, you could tell, and it wasn't really a question. He was mad, and he said to me, I assume your children come first. And I said, well, I'm going to answer that question, but I'd love for you to invite the men to answer this question also. And my answer was often. They come first, often. Sometimes I get home from work and somebody would call and I'd be very quick to say, I can't take this call right now. I just got home with my kids. This can easily wait till tomorrow. But every once in a while, there would be a call that would come in that couldn't wait. And it was really good for my children to have to wait for a little bit for me to deal with that. And I would try to do it as quickly as possible or delegate it to someone else and then get back with them. But as a parent, you want to be present with your children in meaningful ways as often as possible. But that doesn't mean not working, I don't think. Yeah.
Okay, a couple more. We're running out of time. I'm skipping through some of the questions we have, and we want to have just a few minutes at the end to let others ask some questions as well. But so another demographic, let's talk about the younger generation of workers today. So I was just this week, somebody was explaining to me that a boomer who's in a management role had a group of younger team leaders, giving him a pretty difficult assignment, I guess. And one of the young guys, he was 23, as he told me how old the guy was. 23 was on the team, and he said, and so now I'm quoting, is, "We're not going to give ourselves to this job like you boomers did. Overwork is not okay." And essentially said, we're not going to do it. And so the manager ended up caving in, quote, to what he had originally said to the team. So there's a lot happening in that dynamic, and it's certainly an over stereotype on every generation. But generations often respond to each other, and they often correct in helpful ways, and sometimes overcorrect. talk through some of those dynamics and ways that you're encouraged by what Gen Z is bringing to the table. You work with a lot of younger folks.
Yeah.
That's why I know that.
No, and I think the stereotype of they don't have a work ethic is just not true. I think anytime you come across a young leader who doesn't have a work ethic, it's really easy in your frustration to extrapolate that to a whole generation. But I do think younger generations are seeing from their vantage point, hey, I want a life. And I know that in that life, work is going to be a big circle that takes up a lot of space. I don't want it to be the whole of the space. And I want to have a life into which my work fits. I don't want to have a job where I then have to jam all the other parts of my life in and around it. And again, I'll go back to, I think managing our own anxiety is part of the overworking problem. Instead of to say, I think I can get a really good job done in 8 hours a day, sometimes maybe a little bit more, but I can also take time off, and I think I can do really good work, and we can reach our goals.
Yeah, that's great. So I'm going to ask one more, but if anybody does want to ask a question, we have just a few minutes here at the end. This microphone over here, we do, because those of you who are joining us online want to make sure that they can hear the questions that you ask as well. So feel free to go ahead and get in line if you would like to ask a question. I have some I can go back to and skip that we skipped as well. But I want to end with some very practical things. So you've already mentioned several resources: the Steve Cuss book, the Garber book. Keller's book,
Lencioni's
books. So when it comes to the conversation of faith and work, or podcasts, or articles, or places, who are some other voices, or who are some other resources? Where do you typically point people related to that? And then we'll do a second question, not just faith and work, but some of the leadership books that maybe have been helpful to you.
Some of the podcasts that I find helpful, Carey Nieuwhof's podcasts I think are pretty good. Andy Stanley does a podcast on leadership that I like a lot. And then anything around Enneagram, which is just more learning who I am and how my broken parts and my healthy parts fit together. But I think those are probably the top two I listen to on leadership.
Okay. Yeah. I'm going to just keep going. We got just a few minutes since no one's asking questions, but feel free to jump in line if you'd like to. Okay, you told the story of Carlos. That was actually the story that I was hoping you'd tell it. Yeah. So you told it again. That was the guy. I didn't remember his name, but I remember. So just like the intern, I'm the guy. I couldn't remember Carlos's name all these years later. But you connected it in my notes. I went back and you have a connection to a Bible verse. You didn't mention that tonight. And I'm not quizzing you on this one. It was Exodus 35 or Exodus 38 or something like that. Yeah. About as the tabernacle is being carried away, someone's job was to carry the tent pegs.
Yeah, there's this whole, I think it's Exodus 35, all the lists of all the different fine fabrics and metals that make up the tabernacle, and different tribes are assigned to bring them when they're putting the tabernacle up in the desert and when they're tearing it down. And then in the middle of one of the verses, it mentions the tent pegs. It's like, they're not important, they're not impressive, they're not fine fabrics or great metal, they're just the tent pegs. But if the guy with the tent pegs doesn't show up, none of the rest of it matters. Another connection with that is years ago when John's dad was fighting a terminal illness, John took him to the Galapagos Islands. And he said one of the evenings on the boat, the naturalist talked about the flora and fauna and all the reasons people flock to the islands. But he said there's a particular colony of beetles on these islands that support the ecosystem so strongly that if that particular type of beetle ever dies, in 20 years, the ecosystem of the Galapagos Islands would implode. Nobody goes to the Galapagos Islands to see the beetles. But that's how important the beetles are to the ecosystem. So when we treat people, Carlos, like a secondary citizen and you're not as important, we're not living into the kingdom and that vision of people.
Yeah, I mean, that story multiple times has just sort of like come back up in my mind to think through. It's so easy to treat people as a means to an end.
Yes.
And even like when the first time you told the story, I actually thought the point of the story was going to be you can get a lot, as a doctor, you can get a lot more done because Carlos cleans the thing faster than everyone else.
Sure.
Like my instinct was to say, oh yeah, this is more effective for business, and you ended up turning it a different direction. So I was sort of,
I Henry'd it.
Yeah, making him a utility even in doing that, which is
and that's part of why I knew when I was charting, I want to stay here because I have a feeling I know where this might be going. Yeah. And I would like to be a spectator and watch this unfold.
Yeah. Okay, well, I want to be sensitive to your time as well, and so let me just end by asking. I mean, as you've done lots of talks on this, and thank you so much for just sharing. You've kind of given free counseling, free consulting. I mean tonight on this, but just people who may be struggling in their work. Let's end with that question. Maybe they're underemployed. Maybe they're unemployed. Maybe they're just in a season where this is doesn't seem like this is God's plan or best, or they just don't see it. So can you talk to that person as we close?
Yeah, I remember I was going to give a talk on faith and work one time, and I was going through some of my stuff, and John said, they call it work for a reason. It's work. And so I think to remind myself, I'm not in the place I wish I was. I'm not in the job I wish I had. I hope someday that will come, and I want to be on that journey, but while I'm not there yet, I want to show up to work and serve people with as much joy as I can and as much kindness as I can. And when I don't, I want to apologize. I want to try to imagine if Jesus was in my job that wasn't terribly fulfilling, what would he do? And in the middle of that journey, what you must guard yourself against is the sin in John 21 that Jesus got more angry at Peter for than the woman caught in adultery, and it was the sin of comparison. When Jesus said, somebody's going to take you and lead you to where you do not want to go when you're older, Peter did not say, I will surrender to that, God. He said, what about him? And he turned around and he pointed to John. And Jesus got so angry with Peter, and he said, what is it to you if I allow him to remain alive until I return? You follow me. So when I'm not in the job I want and work is a burden, my first thing is going to be to compare myself to everybody who's at the place I wish I was. It's not my journey. My journey is right here. My journey is in reality with God. So how can I surrender to God in the most meaningful way and bring something wonderful to the job that I hate and the people that are a 2 on a scale of 1 to 10 on the number I might have written down this at the beginning of this, and view it differently?
Yeah, that's really helpful.
So.
Well, we talk all the time about one of the best ways to love your neighbor is to work well and do excellent work for God. And you have loved us well by doing good work tonight. So thank you for sharing your work with us.
Thank you so much for having me.
That.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Thanks.
Yeah, that's good.
Okay. Thank you.
As we close, thanks again for being here. We always try to give you a next step of what's coming up. If you're not, by the way, on the Lakelight monthly email, we send out one email a month to try to tell you everything that's going on. You get to see some of the articles that Glenn and Kaylin and others are editing and making sure that there's new stuff coming on all the time. But May the 1st, we have a new class that will be started that Mike Woodruff is actually teaching. It's going to be a 4-week class during May on Thursday nights. And the name of the class is Truth in the Noise, but really he's going to be looking at lots of different things in that, connecting with the culture that we live in today, God's timeless plan, how truth should be, and moving us into thinking even through the Nicene Creed and some essential doctrines of the faith as well. And then how do we live faithfully in the middle of that? So want to put that on your radar. It's on the website. Thank you all for being here tonight, and have a good evening.